This is going to be a $1.9 billion hit to the firearms industry.
But DC bureaucrats have used this agency to infringe on the rights of the American people.
And it has one magazine. So after 30 rounds, I'm done.
By now, instituting this 120-day rule.
Tearing apart families and making our streets less safe.
Let's see what is the most compelling thing to learn from that case. How many times was this gentleman...
Missouri gun law. The recent developments surrounding the Second Amendment sanctuary law in Missouri highlight the ongoing legal battles over the interpretation and enforcement of state and federal laws regarding arm rights. At the center of this issue is the conflict between states' rights under the 10th Amendment and the federal government's authority to regulate arms under the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment sanctuary law in Missouri, passed in 2021, reflects a growing trend among states to assert their sovereignty and resist what they perceive as federal overreach in arm control measures. This law prohibits state and local officials from enforcing federal laws that are deemed to infringe upon the Second Amendment rights of citizens. It also provides for civil remedies against any state agent or employee who assists in enforcing such federal laws. The legal challenge to Missouri's law began when the federal government sued the state, arguing that the law was unconstitutional because it conflicted with the federal government's authority to regulate firearms. The Supreme Court's recent decision to deny a stay in the case means that Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act remains in force for now, pending further legal proceedings. The 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, however, has now scheduled a hearing to reconsider the case. They contend that the federal government has the authority to regulate arms to promote public safety and reduce armed violence. The legal arguments in the case are complex and touch on fundamental principles of constitutional law. The Supreme Court's decision to deny a stay indicates that the justices believe the case raises important questions that warrant further consideration. The 8th Circuit's decision to schedule a hearing suggests that the court is taking the case seriously and recognizes its significance. One key issue in the case is the scope of the federal government's authority to regulate arms under the Second Amendment. While the Second Amendment guarantees the right to bear arms, it also allows for reasonable regulations to promote public safety. The question is where to draw the line between protecting individual rights and regulating arms to prevent armed violence. Another issue is the extent of state rights under the 10th Amendment to resist federal laws they believe are unconstitutional. While states have the authority to pass laws that reflect their policy preferences, they cannot nullify federal laws they disagree with. The challenge for the courts is to determine whether Missouri's Second Amendment sanctuary law is a legitimate exercise of state power or an unconstitutional attempt to defy federal authority. Ultimately, the outcome of the legal battle over Missouri's Second Amendment sanctuary law could have far-reaching implications for armed rights and federalism in the United States. Depending on how the courts rule, it could either strengthen states' rights to resist federal overreach or reaffirm the supremacy of federal law.
My speech is well beyond the 2 minutes that I'm allotted, so I'm just going to dispense with the notes, really.
We are taking action. We are getting things done, and we are trying to save lives.
At the firearm industry. That is all this is and nothing more.
Contrast that with what Republicans did to address gun violence and crime the last time they were in charge.
The impulsive leaders at ATF have once again failed to apply simple logic and reason to their decision-making.
Their answer to gun violence is more guns. And if that's not enough, even more guns.
What's changed is now we have an administration that is desperate to erode our Second Amendment rights.
Regardless of the outcome, it is clear that the debate over arm control and states' rights will continue to be contentious and politically charged. Legal complexities of SAPA. The legal landscape surrounding Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act, SAPA, and its parallels with Texas's SB 8 abortion law illustrate complex dynamics between state and federal authority, individual rights, and enforcement mechanism. In both Missouri SAPA and Texas's SB 8 cases, the laws are structured to shield state officials from lawsuits, leaving private citizens as the primary enforcers. This design aims to make it difficult to challenge the laws through traditional legal avenues, such as obtaining injunctions against state officials. Instead, opponents of these laws must sue individual citizens who might be aiding in their enforcement. This decentralized enforcement mechanism complicates the process of challenging the laws, as each lawsuit targets a specific individual rather than the state as a whole. The recent Supreme Court decision in the SB 8 case affirmed this strategy by denying the ability to seek injunctions against state officials since they are not directly responsible for enforcing the law. This decision effectively shields Texas and its officials from legal challenges, as injunctions cannot be obtained against individuals not directly involved in enforcement. Similarly, in Missouri's case, the denial of a stay by the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals signals a similar challenge for opponents of SAPA. However, the efficacy of this strategy relies on the willingness of individuals to enforce the law, which may vary depending on factors such as public opinion, legal risk, and personal beliefs. Furthermore, the decentralized enforcement mechanism may lead to inconsistencies in enforcement across different jurisdictions within the state. Despite these challenges, opponents of SAPA have pursued legal action, resulting in a district court decision to strike down the entire law. However, this decision faces hurdles due to the decentralized enforcement structure of SAPA. Even if courts rule against the law, individual citizens may continue to enforce it.
And believe me, this rule has nothing to do with gun safety. This has nothing to do with making communities safer.
There are many areas, as you might imagine, especially when you're dealing with firearms, where we just don't know.
Democrats actually passed the Safer Communities Act.
Special order. Thank you so much for highlighting what's going on here.
The ATF before they abolish our Second Amendment rights. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms.
The first piece of major gun safety legislation in decades, and we sent it to President Biden's desk.
So I thought that was very interesting that now we have an unelected swamp creature, a bureaucrat, who thinks that they can now make felons,
leading to ongoing legal battles and potential confusion regarding its enforcement. The legal complexities surrounding SAPA and similar laws highlight broader debates over federalism, individual rights, and the role of the judiciary in resolving disputes between state and federal governments. These issues raise fundamental questions about the balance of power between states and the federal government, the scope of individual rights, and the mechanisms for enforcing and challenging laws. As the legal battle over SAPA and similar laws continue, they will likely have significant implications for armed rights, state sovereignty, and the relationship between state and federal governments. The outcomes of these cases will shape the future landscape of firearms regulation and legal challenges to state laws perceived as infringing upon constitutional rights. Armed rights and legal challenges. Second Amendment sanctuary laws, also known as Firearms Freedom Acts or Second Amendment Preservation Acts, have emerged as a response to perceived federal overreach in arms regulation. These laws aim to protect Second Amendment rights by prohibiting state and local authorities from using resources to enforce certain federal arms control measures they deem unconstitutional. The genesis of these laws can be traced back to concerns among arms rights advocates about potential federal legislation infringing on Second Amendment rights. Amidst debates over arms control at the federal level, particularly in the wake of mass layings and calls for stricter regulations, states and localities have taken proactive measures to safeguard arms rights within their jurisdiction. The legal basis for Second Amendment sanctuary laws often rests on principles of federalism and states' rights. Proponents argue that the 10th Amendment grants states the authority to resist federal encroachment on powers not delegated to the federal government. Others have adopted more limited measures or issued symbolic declarations of support for the Second Amendment. Additionally, the enforcement and interpretation of these laws vary across jurisdictions. leading to inconsistencies in their application. Legal challenges to Second Amendment sanctuary laws have arisen in both state and federal courts. These challenges often center on questions of preemption, federalism, and constitutional interpretation. Courts must grapple with balancing states' rights against federal authority while ensuring consistency with the Constitution and established legal principles. One notable example is the recent case involving Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act.
I get it. My Republican friends are going to complain about the process.
$1.9 billion to law-abiding citizens.
Our right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I yield back.
Not only has it been completely blown out of proportion,
This is the last day before the district work period.
And every conservative in this Congress to stand with Representative Clyde and his legislation and to stand with me.
There's a hearing that you can't be at, your counsel can't be present, you haven't been charged with the crime.
SAPA, the law which prohibits state and local officials from enforcing federal arm control measures, faced legal challenges questioning its constitutionality. After the Supreme Court denied a stay on the law, the case proceeded to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, where arguments were scheduled for expedited review. The outcome of legal challenges to Second Amendment sanctuary law remains uncertain, with courts navigating complex legal issues and competing constitutional principles. As these cases progress through the judicial system, they will shape the future of armed rights regulation and the balance of power between state and federal governments. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.